Imagine standing in the heart of the ancient Near East more than 2,500 years ago, a world where every horizon seemed to belong to a different king, where caravans crossed burning deserts carrying gold, silver, spices, and rumors, where mighty cities rose from fertile river valleys while distant mountains hid tribes that answered to no ruler at all. This was an age of kingdoms, an age of ambition, an age when power was measured not only by the size of an army, but by how long a ruler could hold together the lands he had conquered. Long before the name of the Persian Immortals would echo across the ancient world, before Greek historians would write about them, before they marched beside kings and stood at the center of history's greatest battles, there was a land that would give birth to them, a land of rugged mountains, windswept plains, and people hardened by both geography and survival. Persia. To understand the Immortals, we must first understand the empire that created them, and to understand the empire, we must begin with a man whose vision changed the course of history. Cyrus, the man history would remember as Cyrus the Great. When Cyrus first appeared on the political stage, the world was already dominated by powerful states. The Babylonians ruled the rich lands of Mesopotamia. The Lydians controlled much of Anatolia and commanded enormous wealth. The Medes held influence across the Iranian plateau. These powers looked permanent, unshakable, the kind of states that people assumed would endure forever. But history has a habit of surprising those who believe anything is permanent. Cyrus emerged from the Persians, a people who at the time were not considered the masters of the world. They were respected, they were capable, but they were not yet feared across continents. That would change. What made Cyrus different was not simply his ability to win battles. Many kings could win battles. Many warriors could conquer cities. What made Cyrus extraordinary was his understanding of power itself. He understood that conquest alone was not enough. A city taken by force could rebel. A kingdom humiliated could seek revenge. An empire built only through terror would eventually collapse under its own weight. If a ruler wished to create something lasting, something larger than himself, he needed more than soldiers. He needed loyalty, organization, administration, and above all, he needed institutions strong enough to survive beyond a single generation. As Cyrus expanded his authority, the Persian world began changing rapidly. Tribes that had once acted independently became part of a larger political structure. Regional rivalries were absorbed into a broader identity. The foundations of empire were being laid, not in a single dramatic moment, but piece by piece, campaign by campaign, decision by decision. Cyrus first challenged Median authority. What followed was not merely a military victory. It was a transformation. The Persians did not simply destroy the Median system. They incorporated it. They adapted it. They turned former rivals into partners within a larger imperial framework. This approach would become one of the defining characteristics of Persian rule. Unlike many conquerors who sought to erase what came before them, the Persians often absorbed and reorganized existing structures. It was practical, efficient, and remarkably successful. As Persian influence expanded, so too did the responsibilities of government. Territories had to be managed, roads had to be secured, taxes had to be collected, messages had to travel vast distances. The larger the empire became, the more difficult it was to control, and the more essential it became to have a reliable military corps. Not temporary warriors, not seasonal fighters, but professionals, men whose loyalty was tied directly to the king and the empire, men who could represent Persian authority wherever they went. As Cyrus continued his rise, another great challenge stood before him. The kingdom of Lydia, ruled by Croesus, a king whose wealth became legendary even in his own lifetime. Ancient writers would later use his name as a synonym for immense riches. Croesus possessed resources that many rulers could only dream of. Yet wealth alone does not guarantee security. And when the conflict came, Cyrus proved the stronger leader. The fall of Lydia was more than another conquest. It brought strategic territory, additional manpower, trade routes, and enormous prestige. The empire was growing, and with each victory, the need for elite military forces became even greater, because conquering land was one thing, holding it was another. A ruler could seize a kingdom in a matter of months. Keeping it loyal could require generations. The Persian Empire was becoming something unprecedented, a state stretching across enormous distances, containing different languages, different customs, different religions, different peoples. No ruler in history had successfully managed such diversity on this scale for very long. Yet the Persians would attempt exactly that. And surprisingly, they would succeed. One of the greatest demonstrations of Cyrus's approach came with Babylon. Babylon was no ordinary city. It was among the greatest urban centers on Earth. Its walls were famous, its temples renowned, its history already ancient by the standards of the time. Many expected Babylon to resist fiercely. Many expected bloodshed. Yet Cyrus entered Babylon with remarkably little destruction. The conquest became one of the defining moments of his reign, not simply because of military success, but because of what followed. Rather than presenting himself merely as a conqueror, Cyrus positioned himself as a legitimate ruler, as a protector, as someone restoring order. The strategy worked. Many populations under Persian rule found life surprisingly stable, in some cases even preferable to what had existed before. This reputation became one of Persia's greatest strengths, and it would help sustain the empire for generations. Yet none of this reduced the importance of military power. The empire still required armies. Borders still required defense. Rebellions still needed suppression. Potential enemies still watched for weakness. And as the empire expanded farther across the map, the challenge only grew greater. Imagine trying to govern lands stretching from the Mediterranean world towards Central Asia. Imagine attempting to move information across such distances. Imagine responding to crises that might erupt hundreds or even thousands of miles away. Without modern communication, without modern transportation, without modern technology, the task seems almost impossible. Yet the Persians developed solutions. One of the most important was infrastructure. Roads connected distant regions. Messengers traveled between major centers. Officials coordinated administration across enormous territories. This network became one of the hidden engines of Persian success. But roads alone could not enforce authority. At the end of every message, at the end of every royal order, stood the same question: who would make sure the king's will was obeyed? The answer ultimately required soldiers. Not ordinary soldiers, elite soldiers, trusted soldiers, men whose loyalty was beyond question. The earliest foundations of what would become the Immortals were forming during this era. Not yet as the famous force later described by Greek writers, but as the concept itself began taking shape. A permanent élite corps, drawn from the highest levels of Persian and Median society, connected directly to royal power, serving not merely as warriors, but as symbols of stability, symbols of authority, symbols of empire. The Persian kings understood something crucial. Power is not only exercised, it is displayed. People must see it, feel it, believe in it. An army marching through a province could communicate authority more effectively than 100 written proclamations. And an elite force surrounding the king could reinforce the idea that Persian rule was strong, organized, and enduring. This understanding shaped the development of royal military institutions. The men chosen for elite service were expected to embody Persian values: courage, discipline, loyalty, skill, honor. These ideals were not simply military requirements. They were cultural expectations. From an early age, noble Persian boys were trained in ways that reflected these priorities. Greek observers would later summarize Persian education through three essential skills: riding horses, using the bow, and telling the truth. The phrase became famous because it captured something important about how Persians viewed themselves. A warrior should be physically capable, militarily effective, and morally reliable. Whether reality always matched the ideal is another matter. But the ideal itself shaped generations. The future elite soldiers of Persia grew up immersed in this culture. They learned to ride across difficult terrain, to handle weapons, to endure hardship, to compete for status and honor. Many dreamed of distinction, of serving close to the king, of becoming part of the empire's most respected military circles, because service near the throne brought opportunities unavailable elsewhere: prestige, influence, rewards, advancement. Families whose sons earned such positions gained social standing. Their names carried weight. Their voices mattered. Military service became tied not only to defense of the empire, but to personal ambition, and that combination can be extraordinarily powerful. As Persian authority spread farther outward, the demands placed upon these emerging elite institutions increased. The empire needed men capable of operating in many roles: warriors in battle, guards in palaces, representatives of royal authority, enforcers of order, protectors of the king. Few military organizations in the ancient world carried such a wide range of responsibilities, and fewer still maintained them for centuries. Yet the Persians were building exactly such a system, slowly, carefully, deliberately. Meanwhile, the empire continued expanding. Each new conquest created fresh challenges, new frontiers, new enemies, new opportunities, and through it all, the royal military establishment grew more sophisticated, more organized, more professional. The foundations were being laid for one of the most famous military formations in history, a force that would eventually become known across continents, a force whose reputation would survive long after the empire itself disappeared. Allies would admire, but before that force reached its legendary form, before its traditions became famous, and Cyrus, the man who began it all, would not live forever. But the story was only beginning, because after Cyrus came new kings, new campaigns, new challenges, and from those challenges, the elite guard that history remembers as the Immortals would emerge into full view. Their age was approaching, and with it, the rise of one of the most remarkable military institutions of the ancient world. By the time Cyrus the Great had transformed Persia from a regional power into the center of a vast empire, the world had begun to understand that something extraordinary was taking shape. Kingdoms that once viewed the Persians as distant rivals now found themselves part of a new political reality. From the mountains of Iran to the fertile plains of Mesopotamia, from the wealthy cities of Anatolia to lands farther east, the influence of Persia continued to spread. Yet the greater the empire became, the more difficult it was to hold together. Conquest creates glory. Administration créate permanence. And permanence requires institutions. This was the challenge facing the rulers who followed Cyrus. How do you govern territories so vast that a messenger might spend weeks carrying news from one end of the empire to the other? How do you ensure loyalty among countless local rulers? How do you prevent rebellion? How do you project power across deserts, mountains, rivers, and seas? The answer was not simply more soldiers. The answer was better soldiers. Soldiers who could serve as the visible face of imperial authority. Soldiers whose presence alone carried political meaning. Soldiers who represented not merely military strength, but the stability of the empire itself. This was the environment in which the force later known as the Immortals emerged as a fully developed institution. Their exact origins remain difficult to trace with complete certainty. Ancient history rarely provides the kind of detailed records modern historians would prefer. But by the late 6th century BCE, the elite corps had become one of the most recognizable features of Persian power. To understand why they became so famous, we need to understand what made them different. Most armies of the ancient world relied heavily on temporary service. Farmers became soldiers during campaigns. Citizens answered military obligations when required. Tribes supplied warriors when called upon. But the Immortals were something else. They represented continuity, professionalism, permanence. They existed whether a war was being fought or not, whether the empire was expanding or at peace, whether the king was on campaign or sitting upon his throne. They remained, always present, always available, always prepared. The most famous characteristic of the Immortals was their fixed number. 10,000 men. No more, no less. According to Greek accounts, whenever one member died, another immediately took his place. Whenever illness removed a soldier from duty, a replacement appeared. Whenever battle reduced their ranks, the gaps were filled. To outside observers, the unit never seemed to shrink. It remained constant, unchanging, as if losses simply vanished, as if death itself could not reduce their strength. This is how the name Immortals entered history. Whether the term reflected an exact Persian designation or a Greek interpretation remains debated. But the concept captured something important: the appearance of permanence, the illusion of endless strength, the idea that the force standing before you today would still be standing tomorrow. And next year, and decades from now, even though individual men came and went, the institution endured. In many ways, that was the true source of its power. The individual soldier mattered, but the continuity of the unit mattered more. A king could die, an officer could fall in battle, a veteran could retire, yet the Immortals remained, generation after generation, maintaining the same identity, the same prestige, the same role within the empire. This continuity made them more than a military formation. It made them an institution, and institutions often outlive the people who create them. Membership in this elite force was not open to everyone. The Immortals were drawn primarily from Persian and Median noble families. This served several purposes. First, it ensured loyalty. The men serving closest to the king came from families with a direct stake in the empire's success. Second, it reinforced social hierarchy. Service became a privilege, something to aspire toward, something that enhanced family prestige. Third, it created a common culture within the unit. Shared backgrounds often produce stronger cohesion, and cohesion is one of the most important factors in military effectiveness. A soldier who trusts the men beside him fights differently from one who does not, perhaps not through modern psychology. They knew that, and trust begins with shared identity. A young nobleman seeking entry could not simply claim membership. He needed to demonstrate ability, physical capability. The standards were demanded. These men might one day stand beside the king himself. They might be called upon to defend the empire during moments of crisis. The stakes were too high. Once accepted, the real work began. Archery, formation fighting, physical endurance. The Persian ideal emphasized versatility. A warrior should not depend upon a single skill. The bow held a particularly important place within Persian military culture. While many ancient armies relied primarily on close combat, Persian forces often integrated missile warfare as a central element of battlefield strategy. The composite bow used by Persian archers was a sophisticated weapon, compact enough for practical use, powerful enough to inflict deadly damage. Mastering it required practice, a great deal of practice. The Immortals, therefore, trained extensively as archers. But they were not merely archers. They also learned spear combat, close quarter fighting, formation discipline, and all the other skills expected of elite soldiers. Physical campaigns could involve extraordinary hardships, extreme temperatures. Ancient armies rarely enjoyed comfort. Even elite troops faced exhaustion, disease, injury, and constant uncertainty. An immortal had to function despite these challenges. He had to remain effective when tired, when hungry, when frightened, when conditions turned against him. That resilience could not be improvised during battle. It had to be developed beforehand. Training created habits, and habits often determine survival. The organization of the Immortals reflected the broader efficiency of Persian administration. The empire itself operated through carefully structured systems. Provinces, governors, taxation networks, roads, messengers, records. The military mirrored this administrative logic. Command structures were clear, responsibilities were defined, authority flowed through established channels. At the top stood the king, the great king, the king of kings, the ruler whose authority stretched across continents. Below him served senior commanders. Among them, the leader of the Immortals occupied a uniquely important position because commanding the empire's most prestigious military unit brought enormous influence. This was not simply a battlefield role. It was political, social, and symbolic. The commander stood close to power, close enough to shape events, close enough to affect decisions, close enough to become a major figure in imperial life. Below senior leadership, the force was divided into smaller formations, units of thousands, hundreds, and tens. This decimal organization allowed efficient control even during large-scale operations. Orders could move rapidly through the chain of command. Discipline could be maintained. Complex movements could be coordinated. Such organization might seem ordinary today, but in the ancient world, it represented considerable sophistication. The Persians were not improvising empire. They were engineering it. Equipment reinforced the elite identity of the Immortals. Ancient descriptions and archaeological evidence allow us to form a reasonably clear picture of their appearance. A soldier of the Immortals looked different from many of the enemies he faced. He wore garments suited to the diverse climates of the empire, including trousers that Greek observers often found unusual. Yet practicality frequently triumphs over appearance. And Persian clothing was often better adapted to long campaigns than Greek styles. Over these garments, the soldier wore armor, not typically the massive bronze equipment associated with Greek hoplites, but flexible protection designed to balance defense and mobility. Scale armor composed of small, overlapping pieces offered significant protection while preserving freedom of movement. This reflected a different philosophy of warfare. Persian military doctrine often valued versatility and maneuverability, rather than relying entirely upon heavily armored shock tactics. The spear served as a primary weapon, long enough to threaten opponents before they reached striking distance. Versatile enough for multiple battlefield roles. Alongside it, the soldier carried a sword or dagger, useful when combat closed into deadly proximity. And of course there was the bow. Always the bow, a weapon deeply associated with Persian military identity. The shield completed the defensive system, often constructed from woven materials rather than heavy metal. Light enough to carry over great distances, strong enough to provide meaningful protection. Together, these elements created a soldier capable of operating effectively across a wide range of conditions. And conditions varied enormously across the empire. A campaign in Egypt differed from one in Anatolia. An operation in Central Asia differed from one near the Mediterranean. Flexibility mattered. The Immortals were expected to provide it. Their role extended far beyond warfare. This is one of the most important aspects of their story. Modern audiences sometimes imagine elite units exclusively as battlefield forces. But the Immortals spent much of their existence performing duties unrelated to combat. They guarded palaces, protected royal families, escorted the king during travel, participated in ceremonies, enforced security, maintained order, represented the empire during public events. In many respects, they were as much a political institution as a military one. Every ambassador approaching the Persian court encountered them. Every provincial official seeking royal favor saw them. Every foreign visitor observed them standing watch beside the throne. Their appearance communicated messages before a single word was spoken. The empire is strong. The king is protected. Authority is secure. These messages mattered. Sometimes perception influences politics as much as reality. The Persians understood this well, and they used the Immortals accordingly. Their compensation reflected their status. Elite service brought rewards, regular pay, access to royal favor, opportunities for advancement, potential shares of campaign wealth, privileges extending to families. The empire invested heavily in these men because it expected exceptional service in return. This relationship created powerful incentives. Loyalty was encouraged not only through honor, but through tangible benefits. The families of Immortals often enjoyed elevated status within society. Connections to the royal guard carried influence. Doors opened. Opportunities expanded. Prestige accumulated. Service therefore became both a personal achievement and a family asset. Another factor contributed to their effectiveness: administration. The Persian Empire excelled at administration. Behind every famous warrior stood a system of supply officers, scribes, record keepers, craftsmen, servants, physicians, and countless others whose names history rarely preserves. The Immortals depended upon this invisible machinery. Weapons had to be maintained, armor repaired, food delivered, personnel traqued, replacement selected. Without administration, elite forces deteriorate. The Persians understood that military excellence requires organization, and organization requires bureaucracy. This may sound less exciting than battles and heroes, but empires are sustained by logistics as much as by courage. Perhaps more. As the years passed, the reputation of the Immortals grew alongside the empire itself. Story spread. Enemies learned their name. Allies recognized their significance. Their image became inseparable from Persian power. When people imagine the might of the great king, they often imagine the men who stood closest to him. 10,000 elite warriors, always present, always ready, always appearing unchanged. The Immortals. And soon, under a new ruler named Darius, they would face challenges that would test every aspect of their training, discipline, and reputation. Because maintaining an empire is often harder than creating one. And Darius was about to inherit a world filled with rebellion, uncertainty, and war. When Cyrus the Great died, he left behind something extraordinary. Not simply conquered territory, not merely a collection of victories, but the foundations of an empire unlike any the world had seen before. Yet the death of a great founder often creates uncertainty. Empires are easiest to build around a powerful personality. The real test comes afterward. Can the system survive when the creator is gone? For Persia, that question would soon be answered through crisis, because succession in the ancient world was rarely simple. Power attracted ambition, ambition attracted rivals, and rivals created instability. The empire passed first to Cyrus's son, Cambyses, a capable ruler in many respects, and a king who continued the expansion of Persian power. One of his greatest achievements was the conquest of Egypt, an ancient civilization already thousands of years old, a land whose monuments seemed eternal even in antiquity. The incorporation of Egypt expanded Persian influence dramatically. It also increased the burden of governing the empire. Every new conquest brought wealth, but also responsibilities. More people to govern, more roads to secure, more officials to supervise, more opportunities for rebellion. The empire was becoming vast beyond anything earlier generations could have imagined. And vast empires require constant attention. Then came a period of confusion, a period that remains controversial even among modern historians. Ancient sources tell a dramatic story, a story of deception, impostors, political intrigue, and a struggle for legitimacy. According to the official Persian version later promoted by Darius, a man claiming royal authority had seized power unlawfully, presenting himself as someone he was not. Whether every detail of that account is true remains uncertain. History is often written by those who emerge victorious, and victors naturally shape the narrative. What is certain is that by 522 BCE, Darius emerged as the new ruler of the Persian Empire, and his position was anything but secure. A new king often faces suspicion, especially when his path to power is disputed. Many provinces saw opportunity in the transition. Rebellions erupted. Some leaders declared independence. Others supported rival claimants. Still others simply hoped to escape Persian control altogether. The empire that Cyrus had built suddenly seemed fragile, dangerously fragile. Regions across the imperial map challenged central authority. Babylon rebelled. Elam rose in resistance. Eastern territories became unstable. Claims of loyalty disappeared almost overnight. The situation was exactly the kind of crisis that destroys weak rulers. Darius could not afford hesitation. If he appeared indecisive, the empire might disintegrate. If he appeared weak, others would challenge him. Every action carried enormous consequences. And in this dangerous environment, the Immortals became more important than ever. Because while provincial loyalties shifted, while local rulers calculated their interests, while rebels tested imperial resolve, the king still possessed one decisive advantage. His elite corps, his most trusted soldiers, the men closest to the throne, the men whose loyalty could determine the fate of an empire. The Immortals were not merely observers during this period. They were central participants. Darius relied upon them constantly, as bodyguards, as enforcers, as the hard military edge of royal authority. Wherever crisis appeared most dangerous, elite troops often followed. Their presence reassured loyalists, intimidated opponents, and demonstrated that the king remained capable of decisive action. For nearly 2 years, the empire fought to restore stability. Campaign followed campaign. Victory followed victory. One rebellion was crushed, then another, then another. The process was exhausting, expensive, and often brutal, yet gradually the balance shifted. The empire began holding together. The rebels lost momentum. Darius proved himself not merely a claimant, but a ruler, and as his authority strengthened, the prestige of the Immortals strengthened alongside it. They had helped preserve the empire during one of its most dangerous moments. That achievement would not be forgotten. Once stability returned, Darius turned his attention towards something equally important: reform. Conquest may create an empire. Administration keeps it alive. Darius understood this perhaps better than any Persian king before him. His reign became one of the most significant periods of governmental development in ancient history. He reorganized provinces, standardized taxation, improved communications, expanded infrastructure, strengthened oversight, and transformed the empire into a remarkably sophisticated political machine. The Persian state became more efficient, more predictable, more capable of governing enormous territories. One of his greatest achievements was the expansion of the imperial road network. Roads may sound mundane compared to battles, yet they were among the most important tools of imperial power. Messages traveled faster. Officials coordinated more effectively. Armies moved more efficiently. Commerce expanded. Information flowed. The empire became connected in ways previous civilizations could scarcely imagine. Among these routes, one became especially famous: the Royal Road, stretching across extraordinary distances, linking key centers of administration and commerce. Travelers moving along, it carried not only goods, but news, orders, intelligence, and the authority of the king himself. The Immortals frequently moved along these routes, their presence reinforcing imperial control. Where they appeared, people saw the empire, not in theory, not in law, but in physical form. Well-equipped soldiers, disciplined formation, visible power. Darius also embarked upon major construction projects. Among them was Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of imperial Persia, a city designed not merely for administration, but for symbolism, a place intended to impress, to inspire, to communicate the grandeur of Persian civilization. Everything about Persepolis conveyed authority. Its terraces, its staircases, its columns, its artwork, its scale. Visitors arriving there encountered an environment carefully crafted to project imperial magnificence. And everywhere within this setting appeared images of elite soldiers. The men who protected the king, the men who represented Persian strength, the men history remembers as the Immortals. The famous reliefs of Persepolis preserve some of the most important visual evidence about them. Carved in stone, marching in orderly formation, armed, disciplined, identical in appearance. They seem almost timeless, as though frozen between movement and stillness. Even today, more than 2,000 years later, those figures continue to communicate the same message their creators intended: order, strength, continuity. The carvings reveal something important about Persian political thinking. The individual mattered, but the institution mattered more. The soldier was part of something larger than himself, part of a force that endured across generations, part of a state that claimed permanence. This idea of continuity lay at the heart of the Immortals' identity, and nowhere was it expressed more clearly than at Persepolis. The city itself functioned almost like a stage, a setting where imperial power could be displayed before visiting dignitaries. Delegations arrived from across the empire, bringing tribute, offering loyalty, seeking royal favor. As they approached the king, they passed through spaces watched over by elite guards. The experience was carefully choreographed. Every detail reinforced hierarchy, authority, and legitimacy. The Immortals played a central role in that performance. Yet they were not simply ceremonial figures. Far from it. Their military importance remained substantial. Persia still faced external threats. Border conflicts continued. Campaigns expanded imperial influence. The empire required experienced soldiers capable of operating across vast distances, and the Immortals remained among the most capable troops available. By this period, their organization had become highly refined. Command structures were clear. Training standards were established. Replacement systems functioned efficiently. Administrative support ensured readiness. The force represented centuries of accumulated military experience. Every generation inherited lessons from those who came before. Victories, defeats, adaptations, innovations. The institution learned, and learning institutions are often more powerful than talented individuals, because knowledge survives even when people do not. Life inside the Immortals reflected this professional culture. Training never truly ended. Even veterans continued practicing. Formation drill, weapon exercises, physical conditioning, guard procedures. Combat readiness required constant maintenance. Skills deteriorate when neglected. The Persians understood this. Elite status was not a reward for past achievement. It was a responsibility requiring continual effort. For younger recruits, service brought immense pressure. They entered an organization with expectations built over decades. Every mistake was noticed, every weakness exposed. The standards existed for a reason. The empire depended upon these men. Failure carried consequences not only for individuals, but for the institution itself. And institutions survive only when standards are protected. The rewards made the effort worthwhile. Prestige remained immense. Compensation exceeded that of ordinary troops. Access to influence expanded opportunities. Families benefited. Careers advanced. The social advantages associated with membership became deeply attractive. Across Persian society, ambitious young nobles looked toward the Immortals with admiration, perhaps even envy. To serve among them was to join one of the most respected organizations in the known world. As Darius's reign continued, Persian power reached remarkable heights. Trade flourished. Administration functioned efficiently. Infrastructure connected distant regions. The empire stretched across extraordinary distances. Few rulers in history had ever governed so much territory, and fewer still had done so successfully. The Immortals stood at the center of this achievement. Not alone. No institution operates alone, but as one of its most visible symbols. The image of Persian greatness became closely linked with the image of elite warriors standing beside the throne. Yet success often creates new challenges. The stronger Persia became, the more its interests collided with those of other powers, particularly in the West. Across the Aegean world, tensions were growing. Events were unfolding that would eventually draw Persia into one of history's most famous conflicts. The struggle between the Persian Empire and the Greek city-states. At first, these disputes seemed manageable. Minor disturbances, regional problems, nothing that threatened the empire itself. But history rarely announces its turning points in advance. What begins as a local rebellion can become an international conflict. What appears insignificant can reshape entire civilizations. Soon, the Immortals would face enemies unlike any they had encountered before. Enemies whose methods of warfare differed dramatically from Persian traditions. Enemies who fought not for empire, but for fiercely independent city-states. And when those worlds collided, the reputation of the Immortals would be tested in ways nobody could yet imagine. At the height of Darius's reign, the Persian Empire seemed almost limitless. Its territory stretched farther than most people could comprehend. Its wealth flowed from countless cities and provinces. Its roads connected distant regions. Its administration functioned with remarkable efficiency. And at the center of it all stood the great king, protected by the elite warriors who had become one of the most recognizable symbols of imperial power, the Immortals. Yet even the strongest empire can be drawn into conflict by events that begin far from its capital, far from the throne, far from the king's immediate attention. And that is exactly what happened on the western edge of the Persian world. Along the coast of Anatolia lived Greek-speaking communities known today as the Ionian Greeks. For generations, they had existed within the orbit of larger powers, trading, competing, building prosperous cities, and adapting to changing political realities. When Persian authority expanded into the region, these cities became part of the empire. For a time, the arrangement worked. Trade continued. Local elites retained influence. Life moved forward, but beneath the surface, tensions remained. The Greek city-states possessed a strong tradition of independence. Many valued local autonomy above almost everything else. And while Persian rule often proved more flexible than later stereotypes suggest, not everyone accepted foreign authority willingly. Eventually, dissatisfaction erupted into open rebellion. What began as unrest in a few cities spread rapidly. Leaders emerged. Alliances formed. The situation escalated. And soon the Persian Empire faced a serious challenge in a region that held considerable strategic importance. The Ionian Revolt had begun. For Darius, the rebellion represented more than a local disturbance. It was a test of imperial credibility. If one province could openly defy Persian authority without consequence, others might follow. The empire depended on the perception that rebellion would fail. Allowing successful resistance threatened that perception, and perception often determines political reality. As a revolt expanded, some mainland Greek cities chose to intervene. Among them was Athens. At the time, Athens was far from being the dominant power it would later become, but its involvement carried symbolic significance. A foreign state was now assisting rebels against Persian rule. From the Persian perspective, this transformed the conflict. It was no longer merely an internal matter. The rebellion itself eventually failed. Persian resources were simply too great. The empire mobilized armies, conducted operations systematically, and gradually reasserted control. City after city returned to Persian authority. Resistance weakened. Momentum faded. The revolt collapsed. The empire had survived the challenge. Yet Darius did not forget the role played by Athens and its allies. The rebellion had revealed something important. The western frontier remained unstable, and beyond that frontier existed independent powers willing to interfere in Persian affairs. From the Persian perspective, leaving such threats unchecked seemed unwise. The stage was being set for a much larger confrontation, one that would become famous far beyond anything the participants could have imagined. Throughout these developments, the Immortals remained deeply involved, though not always as the sole or even primary force. They formed part of the military machinery through which Persian authority was maintained. Campaigns required experienced troops, reliable troops capable of operating wherever needed. The Immortals fulfilled those roles repeatedly. Their reputation continued growing. But reputation alone does not win wars. Eventually it must be tested, and that test was approaching. Darius decided to send an expedition westward. Its objectives were straightforward. Punish those who had supported the revolt. Demonstrate Persian power. Expand influence where possible. Restore confidence in imperial authority. The operation would carry Persian arms directly into the Greek world. a world very different from the one Persia had traditionally dominated. Unlike the centralized kingdoms Persia often confronted, Greece consisted of numerous independent city-states, each with its own government, its own ambitions, its own rivalries. Sometimes these cities cooperated, often they did not. To outsiders, Greek politics could appear chaotic, but that same fragmentation created resilience. Defeating one city did not automatically secure obedience from another. The Persians were about to discover just how complicated this environment could become. The first major expedition encountered difficulties before it even reached its intended objectives. Storms devastated portions of the fleet. Logistical problems emerged. The campaign failed to achieve its goals. Yet the setback did not discourage Darius. More carefully organized, more determined, more ambitious. In 490 BC, Persian forces crossed the Aegean once again, moving toward one of the most famous battlefields in history. Marathon. Today the name Marathon immediately evokes images of ancient warfare, but at the time, it was simply a coastal plain not far from Athens. A location where geography, politics, and military strategy converged. The Persian force was substantial, though modern historians debate exact numbers. It included experienced troops, veterans, and elements of the elite military establishment. Among them were members of the Immortals, not necessarily the entire corps, but enough that their performance would become part of the battle's legacy. The Athenians faced a difficult decision: wait behind city walls, negotiate, or fight. They chose to fight, and in doing so, they committed themselves to one of the most consequential battles of the ancient world. The opposing armies represented different military traditions, different tactical philosophies, different understandings of warfare. The Persians emphasized flexibility, misil combat, combined arms operations, coordination among diverse troop types. The Greeks relied heavily upon the hoplite phalanx, a dense formation of heavily armed infantry, shields overlapping, spears projecting forward, designed to function as a collective force rather than as isolated individuals. Each system possessed strengths, each possessed weaknesses. The battle that followed became a dramatic demonstration of those differences. The Athenians advanced, closing the distance rapidly, minimizing exposure to Persian archery. The collision that followed was brutal. Ancient battles often are: noise, confusion, dust, fear, shouting, the sharp impact of shields, the crash of spear against armor. The reality of combat rarely resembles the clean formations shown in artwork. It is chaotic, exhausting, and terrifying. At first, parts of the Persian line performed effectively, particularly near the center, where elite troops, including members of the Immortals, helped absorb the pressure. They fought with discipline, monte en formation, and resisted determined attacks. But battles are not decided only by what happens at the center. The wings matter too, and elsewhere along the battlefield, the situation deteriorated. The Greek attack achieved breakthroughs. Persian formations became disrupted. Pressure increased. What began as a difficult fight gradually became a dangerous one. Then a crisis, then a retreat. The Persian force ultimately withdrew, returning to its ships, leaving the Athenians in possession of the battlefield. Marathon became a Greek victory, a victory celebrated for centuries afterward. For Athens, it was proof that Persian armies could be defeated. For Persia, it was an unwelcome surprise. The defeat did not threaten the empire itself. Persia remained enormously powerful. Its resources dwarfed those of any individual Greek city. Yet the psychological impact mattered. An imperial expedition had failed. Elite troops had fought bravely. But bravery had not guaranteed success. The Immortals emerged from Marathon with their reputation damaged, but not destroyed. They had not collapsed. They had not disgraced themselves. Yet they had experienced something important: defeat. Every elite military organization eventually encounters defeat. The question is how it responds. Some break, others adapt. The Persian Empire chose adaptation. Preparations for future operations continued. Lessons were studied. Adjustments were made. The empire remained committed to projecting power westward, and Darius remained determined to deal with Greece. But fate intervened. Before he could launch another major invasion, Darius died. His passing marked the end of one of the most significant reigns in ancient history. He had inherited instability and rebellion. He left behind a powerful empire, a sophisticated administration, a magnificent capital, and military institutions that remained among the finest in the world, including the Immortals. The throne now passed to his son, Xerxes, a ruler whose name would become inseparable from one of the most dramatic military campaigns ever undertaken. When Xerxes inherited the empire, he also inherited unfinished business. The memory of Marathon remained. The challenge posed by the Greek city-states remained. The question of Persian prestige remained. Many rulers might have chosen caution. Xerxes chose something else. He chose preparation on a scale almost unimaginable. Years were spent gathering resources, organizing forces, constructing infrastructure, planning logistics. The empire mobilized its immense capabilities. Troops arrived from every corner of Persian territory. Different languages, different cultures, different fighting styles, all brought together for a common purpose. Ancient writers later described these preparations with awe, and although many of their numbers were certainly exaggerated, the scale was still extraordinary. This was not merely another campaign. It was one of the largest military enterprises the ancient world had ever seen. And at its heart stood the Immortals, still the Empire's premier elite force, still symbols of royal authority, still expected to lead by example. For them, the coming invasion represented more than another operation. It represented an opportunity to restore prestige, to prove their effectiveness, to demonstrate that Marathon had been an exception rather than a pattern. They trained, prepared, inspected equipment, organized replacements, readied themselves for a campaign that would carry them into the pages of history forever. The roads of Persia filled with movement, soldiers marching, supply trains advancing, messengers traveling, officials coordinating logistics. Every part of the imperial system contributed, because moving such an enormous force required extraordinary organization. And organization was one of Persia's greatest strengths. Eventually the moment arrived. The great invasion began. Xerxes led his army westward, toward Europe, toward Greece, toward destiny. Ahead lay mountains, coastlines, ancient rivalries, and battles that would become legendary. Battles where the Immortals would confront some of the most famous warriors in human history. Battles where courage alone would not be enough. Because soon, in a narrow pass between mountain and sea, the Immortals would face a challenge unlike anything they had encountered before. A place called Thermopylae, a place where their legend would grow, even as their limits were exposed. For years, the Persian Empire had prepared. Resources had been gathered from distant provinces. Roads had been improved. Supply systems organized. Ships assembled. Troops recruited from across an empire that stretched over enormous distances. The scale of the undertaking astonished even ancient observers who were accustomed to grand military campaigns. Wherever the army passed, it left an impression, columns of soldiers extending beyond the horizon, pack animals carrying supplies, engineers building infrastructure, officials coordinating movement, messengers riding between formations. And among this immense host marched the elite warriors whose reputation had already spread far beyond Persia's borders. The Immortals. For many soldiers in the invasion force, this campaign represented duty. For others, opportunity. For some, adventure. But for the Immortals, it carried another meaning: redemption. The memory of Marathon had not disappeared. The Empire had not forgotten. The elite guard had not forgotten. Now, they would have the chance to prove themselves once again before the eyes of the world. The journey westward itself became part of the story. The Persian army crossed from Asia into Europe using a remarkable bridge system constructed across the Hellespont, an engineering achievement that symbolized the ambition of the campaign. The message was clear. The Persian Empire possessed the power not only to move armies across continents, but to reshape geography when necessary. As the army advanced through Thrace and Macedonia, many communities submitted without resistance. Some calculated that opposing Persia would be futile. Others preferred negotiation over destruction. Many simply recognized the overwhelming scale of the force approaching them. Yet farther south, resistance was forming. The Greek city-states remained divided in many respects. Old rivalries had not vanished. Political disagreements continued. But some leaders understood that the threat posed by the invasion was unlike previous conflicts. If they wished to preserve their independence, cooperation would be necessary. One of the most important decisions involved geography. Where should they make their stand? How could a relatively small coalition resist the military resources of an empire? The answer lay in terrain. A narrow coastal passage called Thermopylae, the Hot Gates, a place where mountains pressed close to the sea, creating a corridor so confined that enormous numbers could not easily be brought to bear. For the Greeks, it offered a chance to neutralize Persia's greatest advantage: scale. If the battlefield remained narrow enough, superior numbers mattered less. Discipline mattered more. Courage mattered more. Position mattered more. The Greeks dispatched a force to hold the pass. Among them were warriors who would become legendary, most famously the Spartans under King Leonidas. Yet it is important to remember that Thermopylae was not only a Spartan story. Many Greek communities contributed men to the defense. They stood together, knowing the odds were difficult, knowing the danger was immense, knowing they faced one of the most powerful empires on earth. When the Persian army approached, the contrast was striking. An enormous imperial force confronting a relatively small defensive coalition. From a distance, the outcome may have appeared inevitable. Many probably assumed resistance would collapse quickly. Ancient history often rewards numbers. Yet history also rewards preparation. And the Greeks had chosen their battlefield carefully. Xerxes expected success. Why wouldn't he? His army had crossed continents. Cities had submitted. The empire's resources seemed inexhaustible. Surely this narrow obstacle could be cleared. The Persians initially attempted to compel surrender. Negotiation remained preferable to unnecessary bloodshed. But the defenders refused. The standoff ended, and battle became unavoidable. The first assaults began. Persian troops advanced into the pass, only to discover that the terrain imposed severe limitations. The narrow corridor prevented effective use of large formations. Soldiers could not easily maneuver around the defenders. Missile fire had reduced effectiveness. The Greeks remained protected behind shields and armor. What followed surprised many observers. Wave after wave attacked. Wave after wave failed. The defenders maintained cohesion. Their heavy armor and disciplined formations proved extremely effective under these conditions. The pass itself became a weapon. Every advantage the Greeks possessed was amplified by the terrain. Every advantage the Persians possessed was reduced. This did not mean Persian soldiers fought poorly. Far from it. Many fought bravely. Many died bravely. But courage alone cannot overcome unfavorable conditions. Eventually, Xerxes turned to the troops he trusted most, the elite force whose reputation stood above all others. The Immortals. If anyone could break the Greek line, surely it would be them. For the men of the Immortals, the order carried immense significance. They were the Empire's finest infantry, the king's chosen warriors, the standard by which other troops were judged. Now, they were being called upon to resolve a battle that had already frustrated ordinary assaults. The pressure must have been enormous, because elite status brings expectations, and expectations create burdens. The Immortals advanced. Formation disciplined, weapons ready, years of training behind every movement, centuries of developing military traditions embodied in every rank. Ahead stood the defenders, waiting, prepared, determined. The collision was fierce. Ancient sources describe repeated attacks, repeated attempts to force a breakthrough, repeated failures. The Greeks held, again and again. The Immortals pushed forward, again and again. The line remained intact. Modern discussions sometimes misunderstand what this means. The failure to break the position does not imply weakness. The conditions strongly favored the defenders. Military history is filled with examples where excellent troops struggled against well-prepared opponents occupying superior terrain. Thermopylae was one of those examples. The Immortals fought skillfully, but skill could not eliminate geography. The narrowness of the pass prevented them from exploiting their flexibility, their archery, their numbers, their ability to maneuver. Everything narrowed into brutal frontal combat, exactly the kind of fighting that favored heavily armored Greek hoplites. For 2 days the struggle continued. The defenders remained in place. The Persian advance stalled. Xerxes watched one of the most powerful armies in the world held back by a tiny fraction of its size. It was frustrating, embarrassing, potentially dangerous. Every additional day allowed Greek resistance elsewhere to strengthen. Every delay damaged the image of unstoppable Persian momentum. Something had to change, and then it did, not because of battlefield brilliance, not because the defenders suddenly weakened, but because information altered the situation. A local Greek revealed the existence of a mountain path, a route that bypassed the main position, a route capable of carrying troops around the defenders. The strategic equation changed immediately. The Greeks at Thermopylae had relied upon geography. Now geography threatened them. Once Leonidas learned what was happening, he understood the reality. The position could no longer be held indefinitely. Encirclement was coming. Most of the Greek force withdrew, but Leonidas and a smaller group remained, whether to delay the Persians, to fulfill obligations, to preserve honor, or some combination of all three. Their decision would become one of history's most famous last stands. As Persian forces advanced through the mountain route and descended behind the defenders, the final battle began. The remaining Greeks fought with extraordinary determination. The struggle became desperate, close range, personal, the kind of combat where survival depended not on grand strategy, but on individual endurance. The Immortals participated in these final operations, advancing as part of the forces closing the trap. Eventually resistance ended. The defenders were overwhelmed. Thermopylae became a Persian victory. The road south lay open. The invasion could continue. Yet victory came with complications. The battle had revealed uncomfortable truths. The Immortals had not swept aside the defenders, as many expected. Persian forces had required alternative solutions. The Greeks had demonstrated that disciplined infantry occupying favorable terrain could resist even elite troops for extended periods. Military reputations survived the battle, but they changed. The Greeks gained heroes. The Persians gained lessons. Both sides left Thermopylae with stories that would echo through history. For the Immortals, the experience was significant. They had fought courageously. No serious ancient source suggests otherwise. Yet they had encountered limitations. Not failures of discipline, not failures of bravery, but limitations imposed by tactical circumstances. This distinction matters because military excellence does not mean winning every engagement. It means performing effectively under difficult conditions. The Immortals had done so, but the myth of effortless superiority had begun to crack. As the invasion continued southward, the Persian army advanced into central Greece. Cities were abandoned, populations evacuated, resistance reorganized. The war entered a new phase. Eventually, the Persians reached Athens, the city that had helped ignite conflict decades earlier. The city associated with Marathon, the city that had become a symbol of Greek resistance. Its population largely gone, its defenders withdrawn. Athens fell. The Persians occupied it. Parts of the city were burned. Ancient grievances were answered with imperial vengeance. From one perspective, the campaign seemed successful. The road through Greece had been opened. The enemy's most famous city stood under Persian control. The empire appeared closer than ever to achieving its objectives. Yet beneath the surface, danger remained. Because wars are not won simply by occupying cities. They are won by destroying an opponent's ability and willingness to resist. And Greek resistance had not ended. It had merely shifted. Soon the conflict would move from narrow mountain passes to the sea. And there, events would unfold that would alter the entire course of the invasion. Events that would ultimately shape the future of the Immortals, the future of Persia, and the future of the ancient world itself. When the Persian army entered Athens, it appeared to many that Xerxes stood on the edge of complete victory. The city that had once defied the empire at Marathon had been abandoned. Its people had fled. Its temples and buildings now stood under Persian control. For an emperor who commanded the largest military expedition of his age, the achievement seemed to confirm what many already believed, that resistance to Persia was ultimately futile. The Immortals marched through the conquered landscape as symbols of that success. Elite warriors at the center of a campaign that had crossed continents, survived enormous logistical challenges, and pushed deep into the Greek world. Yet appearances can be deceptive. History is filled with moments when victory seems close, only to slip away unexpectedly. And Greece was about to provide one of the most famous examples. Although Athens had fallen, its people had not surrendered. Many had evacuated to nearby islands. Others joined the Greek fleet. The war continued, and increasingly, the decisive theater of operations was not on land, but at sea. For Persia, naval power had always been important. The empire depended upon maritime connections, trade routes, and coastal operations. Its fleet included ships and crews from many different regions. Phoenicians, Egyptians, Cypriots, and others who brought generations of seafaring experience. The Persian fleet was formidable, large, experienced, and essential to supporting the invasion. Yet the Greeks also possessed significant naval strength, particularly Athens, which had invested heavily in warships during the years before Xerxes' invasion. These ships represented more than military assets. They represented survival. Without them, resistance might collapse. With them, opportunities remained. The Greek leaders understood something crucial. If they could damage Persian naval superiority, they might change the entire strategic situation. And so attention focused on a narrow body of water near Athens, a place called Salamis. The geography of Salamis resembled Thermopylae in one important respect. It restricted movement. Large forces could not maneuver freely. The environment favored smaller numbers. Careful positioning and local knowledge. The Greeks hoped to exploit these advantages, just as they had done on land. Xerxes believed his fleet could crush Greek resistance. The logic seemed reasonable. Persia possessed immense resources. Its navy outnumbered the enemy, and many of its commanders expected success. But warfare rarely follows simple arithmetic. The battle that followed became one of the defining naval engagements of ancient history. Greek ships fought aggressively. The narrow waters disrupted Persian coordination. Formations became crowded. Communication became difficult. Confusion spread. One ship collided with another. Orders became harder to execute. And gradually, the advantages of size began turning into disadvantages. The battle descended into chaos. Crews struggled. Commanders adapted as best they could. The sea filled with wreckage. Broken oars, shattered hulls, and desperate men fighting for survival. When it was over, the Persian fleet had suffered a devastating defeat. Not complete destruction, but enough to transform the strategic picture. The consequences were enormous. Without unquestioned naval superiority, maintaining such a large army deep inside Greece became much more difficult. Supply lines grew vulnerable. Future operations became uncertain. The momentum that had carried the invasion forward suddenly slowed. For Xerxes, the situation demanded difficult decisions. Eventually, he chose to return to Asia with part of his forces, leaving a substantial army behind under experienced commanders. The campaign would continue, but the dream of immediate and decisive victory had faded. The war was no longer a straightforward march toward success. It had become a struggle. The Immortals remained part of this continuing effort, still elite, still respected, still central to Persian military operations, but now operating in a campaign that felt very different from the confident advance of earlier months. The Greeks had survived, and survival often creates opportunity. As resistance strengthened, both sides prepared for another major confrontation, this time on land, a confrontation that would become known as the Battle of Plataea. By the following year, Greek forces had gathered in substantial numbers. Various city-states contributed troops. Old rivalries were temporarily set aside. The threat remained too great for division. Meanwhile, the Persian army maintained its position, seeking favorable conditions, looking for opportunities, preparing for battle. The two forces eventually faced one another across the landscape of central Greece. What followed was not a simple clash. Ancient battles often involved days of maneuvering, positioning, supply concerns, psychological pressure, command decisions. Plataea was no exception. Both sides searched for advantages. Both sides understood the stakes. For the Greeks, defeat might mean subjugation. For the Persians, defeat threatened the entire campaign. Eventually, the confrontation became unavoidable. Battle erupted. Across the field, formations advanced. Missiles flew. Commands echoed. Dust rose beneath thousands of feet. The Immortals occupied their traditional role near the center of Persian operations. Once again, they found themselves confronting heavily armed Greek infantry. Once again, discipline and courage would be tested under extreme pressure. Accounts differ on specific details. Ancient historians often disagreed, exaggerated, or emphasized different aspects of events. Yet the broad outcome is clear. The Greek coalition achieved victory. The Persian army suffered a major defeat. and the invasion's remaining hopes collapsed. The campaign that had begun with such confidence ended in disappointment. Persian forces withdrew. The immediate threat to Greek independence passed, and the balance of power shifted dramatically. For the Greeks, the victory became a foundational memory, proof that unity and determination could overcome overwhelming odds. For Persia, it became a lesson in the limits of power. Even the greatest empire in the world could not always impose its will. Not everywhere, not under every condition. The Immortals emerged from these wars with a complex legacy. They had fought bravely, repeatedly. No credible source portrays them as cowards. At Marathon, Thermopylae, and Plataea, they demonstrated discipline under difficult circumstances. Yet they had also encountered opponents whose methods challenged traditional Persian strengths. The Greek hoplite system proved formidable, especially in terrain that restricted maneuver, especially when defenders maintained cohesion, especially when morale remained strong. The wars exposed limitations, not only in the Immortals, but in the broader Persian military system. And recognizing limitations is often the first step toward adaptation. Back in Persia, life continued. Empires do not disappear because of a single campaign. Despite setbacks in Greece, the Persian Empire remained immense. Its wealth remained vast. Its administration remained sophisticated. Its armies remained powerful. Most subjects of the empire lived far from the battlefields of Greece. Their daily lives continued largely unchanged. Taxes were collected. Trade moved along roads. Governors managed provinces. The machinery of empire kept functioning. The Immortals returned to roles beyond warfare. Many resumed palace duties, guarding royal residences, escorting the king, participating in ceremonies, maintaining order. The image of elite warriors standing watch over imperial authority remained as important as ever, perhaps even more important, because military setbacks often increased the value of visible stability. The empire needed symbols of continuity, and few symbols were more powerful than the Immortals. Years passed. The immediate crisis faded. New generations entered service. Veterans retired. Young recruits took their places. The replacement system continued functioning exactly as intended. Individual lives ended. The institution endured. To outsiders, the Immortals still appeared unchanged. The same numbers, the same prestige, the same role. That illusion of permanence was one of their greatest strengths. But beneath the surface, changes were occurring. The empire itself was evolving. The political landscape was shifting. New challenges emerged. And over time, the focus of the Immortals would increasingly move away from grand foreign invasions and toward another battlefield altogether. The battlefield of palace politics. Because some of the greatest threats to Persian kings would not come from foreign armies. They would come from within their own court, within their own administration, and sometimes from men standing closer to the throne than anyone else, including members of the very force sworn to protect it. The coming years would reveal a difficult truth. Guarding an empire from external enemies is challenging. Guarding it from internal ambition can be even harder. And for the Immortals, the next chapter of their history would be fought not only with spears and bows, but with loyalty, influence, intrigue, and power. When people think about the Persian Immortals, they often imagine battlefields, rows of elite warriors advancing beneath the banners of the great king, spears glinting in the sunlight, arrows darkening the sky, the thunder of armies moving across vast landscapes. And while the Immortals certainly fought in many campaigns, warfare was only one part of their existence. In truth, Much of their importance came from something less dramatic, but far more constant. They were the guardians of the throne. Every day, every season, every year, whether the empire was at war or at peace, the king required protection, the palace required security, the government required stability, and the immortals stood at the center of all three. To understand their true significance, we must step away from the battlefield and enter the royal heart of the Persian Empire. Imagine approaching Persepolis at the height of its splendor. Long before ruin and time reduced it to silent stone, the city rises before you, terraces carved into the landscape, towering columns reaching toward the sky, monumental stairways, decorated halls, magnificent architecture designed to inspire awe. Everything about the place communicates authority. This is not merely a residence. It is a statement, a declaration of imperial power visible to every visitor. Delegations arrive from distant provinces. Envoys bring tribute. Officials report to the king. Merchants seek opportunities. Nobles pursue influence. Thousands of people move through the complex over the course of a year, and all of them encounter the same reality. The king is never alone. The immortals are everywhere, standing at gates, watching entrances, patrolling corridors, guarding treasuries, protecting royal chambers, lining ceremonial routes, observing visitors, listening, assessing, ready to act if necessary. Their presence transforms the palace itself. A building becomes a fortress. A court becomes a secure center of power. The Persian kings understood something that many rulers throughout history would later learn the hard way. The greatest danger often comes from proximity. Enemies on distant frontiers are visible. Conspirators inside the palace are not. The closer someone stands to power, the more dangerous they can become, which meant the men guarding the throne had to be trusted absolutely, or at least as absolutely as human beings can be trusted. That trust made service in the immortals unique. An ordinary soldier might spend years without seeing the king directly. An immortal could stand only a few feet away, watching royal audiences, accompanying state ceremonies, protecting the ruler during moments of immense political significance. They occupied spaces where history was made, and because of that, they often knew things others did not. They heard conversations, observed tensions, recognized changing alliances, not officially as spies, but as men constantly present where important events occurred. Knowledge became one of the hidden privileges of their position, and knowledge is a form of power. The organization of palace security reflected the importance of their duties. Guard assignments rotated regularly. No soldier remained in a single position indefinitely. This prevented complacency, reduced vulnerability, and ensured broad experience throughout the unit. Some men watched gates, others guarded treasuries, some stood within ceremonial halls, others patrolled residential areas. The schedule changed, assignments shifted, responsibility moved from one group to another. Everything was designed to maximize security. Even access to the king followed strict procedures. The Persian court operated according to elaborate protocols. Not everyone could simply approach the monarch. Rank mattered, status mattered, permission mattered. The immortals enforced these rules. Visitors passed through layers of security. Identities were confirmed. Procedures followed. The system reinforced hierarchy while reducing risk. To foreign observers, these rituals sometimes seemed excessive, but from the Persian perspective, they were practical. A ruler who controlled an empire stretching across continents could not afford carelessness. The consequences might be catastrophic. Daily life for an immortal assigned to palace service demanded remarkable discipline. Before dawn, soldiers prepared themselves, equipment inspected, clothing adjusted, weapons checked. These men represented the empire's elite. Standards remained high. Then came the long hours. Remaining alert, waiting. Guard duty is often tedious. And yet history repeatedly demonstrates that successful security depends upon maintaining vigilance during uneventful periods. The dangerous moment rarely announces itself in advance. The challenge lies in remaining ready despite monotony. For the Immortals, this became an essential skill. A warrior capable of charging in a battle might still struggle with hours of motionless observation. Yet both tasks were necessary. Both required discipline. The physical demands should not be underestimated. Ancient armor, long period standing, harsh weather, exhaustion. These conditions tested endurance in ways modern audiences sometimes overlook. An immortal was expected to maintain perfect composure regardless of discomfort, to stand still when movement would be easier, to remain focused when distraction tempted, to project confidence even when tired. Such discipline contributed significantly to their reputation. The king's personal guard occupied the most prestigious positions within the unit. These men stood closest to the monarch, protected him during travel, accompanied him during ceremonies, and formed the final layer of security around the throne. Their responsibilities were enormous. Any failure would carry consequences extending far beyond personal embarrassment. The safety of the ruler affected the stability of the empire itself, because ancient monarchies often depended heavily upon individual leadership. A sudden death could trigger succession crises, civil conflict, regional rebellions, political chaos. Protecting the king therefore meant protecting the state. Yet this relationship between ruler and guard contained a hidden tension. The men best positioned to defend the king were also best positioned to harm him. History repeatedly reveals this paradox. Elite guards can become protectors, or kingmakers, or conspirators, sometimes all three. The Persian Empire was not immune. Over the centuries, palace politics occasionally reached dangerous levels. Ambitious nobles competed for influence. Succession disputes emerged. Court factions maneuvered against one another. And because the Immortals occupied such a central position within the power structure, they inevitably became involved. One of the most striking examples came after the death of Xerxes. The empire faced a period of uncertainty. Intrigue spread through the court, and violence reached even the highest levels. The king himself was assassinated, a shocking event for an institution whose purpose included royal protection. The details remain debated by historians. Ancient sources often disagree, but the broader lesson is clear. No security system is perfect. No institution is immune to corruption. No empire escapes political struggle forever. For the Immortals, these events created challenges that military training alone could not solve. How does an elite guard maintain loyalty during succession disputes? How does it navigate competing claims? How does it avoid becoming merely another political faction? The answers were never simple. Different kings approached the problem differently. Some rewarded loyalty generously. Others relied upon fear. Most used combinations of both. Material benefits played an important role. The Immortals received superior compensation compared to ordinary soldiers. Pay, privileges, access, opportunities. These rewards encouraged loyalty while reinforcing status. Families benefited as well. Connections to the royal guard opened doors throughout Persian society. Parents took pride in sons who earned admission. Marriage prospects improved. Influence expanded. The social advantages became significant in many ways. Membership in the Immortals functioned as both a military career and a path into the upper levels of imperial life. Their role extended beyond the palace walls. The capital city itself depended upon them. They patrolled important areas, protected administrative buildings, guarded treasury facilities, escorted important officials, and responded to disturbances when necessary. Modern societies often separate military and police functions. Ancient empires frequently combined them. The Immortals therefore served as both defenders and enforcers. Maintaining order as well as security, the royal treasury represented one of their most sensitive responsibilities. The Persian Empire accumulated extraordinary wealth, tribute from provinces, taxes, trade revenue, campaign spoils, precious metals, luxury goods, all flowed toward imperial centers. Protecting these resources required trustworthy personnel. The temptation presented by such wealth was obvious, which is why penalties for theft or corruption were severe. The empire could not tolerate dishonesty among those entrusted with its greatest assets. Most immortals appear to have accepted this reality. Professional reputation mattered. Onomater, the institution's standing depended upon maintaining standards. When kings traveled, security became even more complicated. The Persian court was mobile. Rulers frequently moved between residences depending upon season and circumstance. Each journey required careful planning. Routes assessed, stops secured, threats evaluated. The Immortals formed the core of these protective operations. Riding with the king, garding camp, watching roads, remaining alert in unfamiliar environments. Travel exposed vulnerabilities, and the guard's job was to reduce them. These journeys also revealed the empire to itself. As royal processions passed through provinces, local populations saw imperial authority in motion. Officials gathered, petitions were presented, disputes resolved, tribute delivered, and throughout it all, the Immortals remained visible. Symbols of continuity connecting distant regions to the throne. For ordinary people, encountering the Immortals could be memorable. Many subjects of the Empire never visited Persepolis, never attended court, never saw the king, but they might see the royal guard. Tall spears, distinctive clothing, discipline formation, a reminder that even far from the capital, the Empire remained present. The psychological effect was significant. Power often depends as much upon perception as force. The Immortals embodied both. They were not merely soldiers. They were a message, a living statement that Persian authority remained organized, watchful, and prepared. Yet while they guarded the throne and projected stability, deeper changes were unfolding throughout the empire. Generations passed. The world evolved. New military ideas emerged. New enemies appeared. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the balance of power began to shift. The Immortals remained prestigious, but the empire they served was entering a different age. An age where maintaining greatness would prove harder than achieving it. An age where old strengths would face new challenges, and where the shadow of decline would gradually begin to stretch across the Persian world. At their greatest moment, the Immortals stood at the center of the most powerful empire on Earth. The Persian Empire stretched across an astonishing expanse of territory, from the shores of the Mediterranean, across Mesopotamia, through the Iranian plateau, toward the mountains and river valleys of Central Asia, and into lands that approached the borders of India. Millions of people lived under Persian rule. Hundreds of cities contributed to its wealth. Countless roads connected its provinces. Its kings commanded resources that earlier rulers could scarcely imagine. And wherever imperial authority appeared, the Immortals stood nearby. They had become more than soldiers, more than guards, more than an elite military unit. They had become one of the defining symbols of Persian civilization itself. For generations, their reputation continued to grow. Young nobles dreamed of joining their ranks. Families celebrated sons who earned positions among them. Foreign visitors described them. Enemies respected them. The institution had survived changes in rulers, military campaigns, political crises, and enormous transformations within the empire. To many observers, it seemed permanent, almost timeless. But history teaches a difficult lesson. Nothing remains at its peak forever. Not kingdoms, not armies, not institutions, not even empires. The first signs of change rarely appear dramatic. There is no single moment when greatness suddenly ends. Instead, small shifts accumulate, problems emerge, challenges multiply, and eventually a pattern becomes visible. For Persia, that process unfolded gradually. After the great wars with Greece, Persian kings increasingly focused on preserving the empire rather than expanding it. This was not necessarily weakness. In many ways, it reflected practical reality. The empire was already enormous. Administering existing territory required tremendous effort. Holding distant provinces together demanded constant attention. Consolidation became the priority. For the Immortals, this shift altered daily life. Large-scale campaigns became less frequent than during the age of Cyrus or Darius. Palace service assumed greater importance. Security responsibilities expanded. Political functions grew increasingly significant. The unit remained elite, but its battlefield experience became less continuous. And military effectiveness is difficult to maintain when opportunities for real combat decline. Training can preserve skills, but combat teaches lessons no training ground can fully replicate. Meanwhile, challenges emerge from within the empire itself. One of the greatest strengths of Persian rule had always been diversity. Different peoples, different languages, different religions, different traditions, all operating within a broader imperial framework. Yet diversity also created complexity. Regional interests sometimes conflicted with central authority. Provincial governors developed their own ambitions. Local elites pursued independent agendas. The larger the empire became, the harder it was to manage every tension. The Immortals frequently found themselves dealing with these internal problems. Rebellions required suppression. Disloyal officials required replacement. Troubled provinces required demonstrations of imperial power. Again and again, the elite guard was called upon to restore order, not because ordinary troops were incapable, but because sending the king's own warriors communicated seriousness. Their presence sent a message. The throne is watching. The empire remains strong. Obedience is expected. Often a message worked. Sometimes it did not. One region that repeatedly challenged Persian authority was Egypt. Ancient, wealthy, proud. Egypt had become part of the empire through conquest, but maintaining control over it proved difficult. Revolts erupted periodically. Local resistance persisted, and Persian rulers were forced to devote considerable attention to keeping the region under control. The Immortals participated in several operations connected to these struggles, campaigning far from the imperial heartland, marching through difficult terrain, attempting to preserve authority in lands that never fully embraced Persian rule. These campaigns revealed an important reality. The empire remained powerful, but governing distant territories required constant effort. Control was never automatic. Every generation had to maintain what previous generations had built. Another challenge emerged from changes in warfare itself. Military systems evolve. New ideas appear. Successful tactics spread. Technologies improve. And armies that fail to adapt eventually encounter problems. The Greeks continued developing their methods. Their hoplite formations became increasingly refined. Professional soldiers gained experience through decades of conflict. Military innovation did not stop simply because the Persian Wars ended. Elsewhere, different forms of warfare also evolved. Cavalry became increasingly important. Siege techniques improved. Command structures grew more sophisticated. The military environment of the 4th century BCE differed significantly from that of Cyrus's era. The Immortals adapted where possible. Equipment changed gradually. Training evolved. Lessons were incorporated. But adaptation within large institutions is often slow. Traditions create strength, yet traditions can also create inertia. The very qualities that make an institution stable sometimes make change more difficult. At the same time, Persian rulers increasingly relied upon foreign mercenaries, particularly Greek mercenaries. This development carried important implications. The decision made practical sense. Greek soldiers had demonstrated effectiveness. Professional warriors were always valuable, and mercenaries could be deployed without drawing heavily upon Persian manpower. Yet their growing presence subtly altered the military landscape. The Immortals remained prestigious, but they no longer stood alone as the Empire's unquestioned elite force. Competition existed. Alternative models existed. The military monopoly of prestige began to weaken. This did not immediately reduce their importance, but it changed perceptions. And perceptions matter, particularly within aristocratic societies where status carries political significance. The court itself became increasingly complicated. Succession disputes emerged more frequently. Noble families competed for influence. Powerful officials accumulated authority. The empire's political system remained functional, but tensions multiplied. The Immortals often found themselves navigating these dangerous waters, because proximity to power brings unavoidable involvement in politics. Every change of ruler affected them. Every succession required choices. Every court struggle tested loyalties. Ancient sources preserve stories of conspiracies, assassinations, plots, and factional rivalries. Some stories may be exaggerated. Others probably contain substantial truth. What matters is the pattern. The Persian court had become a place where military power and political ambition intersected constantly, and the Immortals occupied the center of that intersection. One of the most revealing moments came during the reign of Artaxerxes II. His rule faced a challenge from within his own family. His brother, Cyrus the Younger, decided to pursue the throne. The resulting conflict became one of the most fascinating episodes in Persian history, because Cyrus recruited a large force of Greek mercenaries, experienced warriors willing to fight for pay. Their presence would later become famous through the writings of Xenophon, who participated in the campaign and left one of the ancient world's most remarkable first-hand military accounts. The armies eventually met near Babylon, at a place called Cunaxa. The battle demonstrated both the continuing strengths and emerging weaknesses of the Persian military system. The Immortals fought on behalf of the reigning king, holding critical positions, maintaining discipline, performing the role expected of elite troops. And ultimately, their side prevailed. Cyrus the Younger was killed. The rebellion collapsed. The throne survived. On the surface, it appeared a clear success. Yet the aftermath told a more complicated story. The Greek mercenaries who had fought for Cyrus found themselves stranded deep inside Persian territory, far from home, surrounded by hostile forces, cut off from support. Most observers expected their destruction. Instead, they organized, adapted, and began one of the most famous retreats in military history. The March of the 10,000. Against extraordinary odds, they fought their way northward, escaping Persian attempts to destroy or capture them, eventually reaching safety after an epic journey. For Greek observers, the event became legendary. For Persian observers, it was troubling. A relatively small force had survived inside the empire despite every effort to stop it. The implications were difficult to ignore. Military prestige shifted subtly. Questions emerged. Assumptions changed. And the reputation of Greek professional soldiers continued rising. Meanwhile, the empire itself faced increasing pressures. Some provinces drifted toward semi-independence. Governors accumulated local power. Communications across enormous distances remained challenging despite the impressive road network. Regional loyalties sometimes outweighed imperial ones. No single crisis threatened immediate collapse. Instead, the empire experienced something perhaps more dangerous: gradual erosion, the kind that unfolds over generations. Too slowly for many contemporaries to recognize fully, yet obvious in retrospect. The Immortals experienced this transformation firsthand. They remained respected, well-equipped, influential, but they increasingly served a system struggling to maintain the energy and cohesion that had characterized earlier centuries. The age of relentless expansion was gone. The certainty of imperial supremacy was fading. The empire still appeared magnificent. Persepolis still stood. Tribute still arrived. The throne still commanded immense wealth. But beneath the surface, cracks were spreading. Some kings attempted reforms. Others pursued military campaigns intended to restore authority. At times they achieved success. Egypt was reconquered after periods of rebellion. Provincial challenges were suppressed. Imperial control strengthened temporarily. Yet these victories often resembled repairs rather than renewal. The underlying difficulties remained, and time was running out because beyond the western horizon, a new power was rising. At first, few Persians paid much attention. It seemed like just another kingdom, just another player in the endless political struggles of the Greek world. But this kingdom possessed something unusual, a ruler of extraordinary ability, and later, a successor whose ambition would reshape history. Macedon, the name meant little compared to Persia, at least initially, yet within a few decades. It would produce the man who would confront the Immortals in their final and greatest test. A young king whose name would become famous in every corner of the ancient world. Alexander. And when he began moving east, the Immortals would discover that the greatest threat to the Persian Empire was no longer internal rebellion, no longer Greek city-states, no longer distant provincial unrest. It was a single commander leading a military machine unlike anything Persia had ever faced. A commander who intended not merely to challenge the empire, but to conquer it. By the middle of the 4th century BCE, the Persian Empire was still one of the largest and wealthiest states on earth. Its palaces remained magnificent. Its roads still stretched across continents. Its treasuries held immense riches. Its kings commanded vast armies. And the Immortals still existed, still standing guard, still carrying the traditions of generations before them, still representing the military heart of the empire. Yet history often hides its greatest turning points behind appearances of stability. From a distance, Persia looked powerful, but beneath the surface, centuries of strain had accumulated. Political rivalries, regional tensions, military stagnation, administrative challenges. None of these problems alone could destroy an empire. Together, they weakened it. And at exactly that moment, a new force appeared in the west. A force led by a young king whose ambition exceeded anything the Persian court could have imagined. Alexander of Macedon. When Alexander became king in 336 BCE, he was only 20 years old. Many expected him to fail. Many expected rivals to overthrow him. Many assumed Macedonia itself would fracture. Instead, he moved with astonishing speed. Internal opposition was crushed. Greek resistance was subdued. His authority was secured. And then he turned east, toward Persia. To many Persians, the threat may not have seemed extraordinary at first. The empire had faced Greek enemies before. It had survived rebellions, invasions, civil wars, and countless crises. Why should this young king be any different? But Alexander was different. He inherited not only a strong kingdom, but one of the most effective military systems ever developed in the ancient world. His army combined discipline, professional experience. At its center stood the Macedonian phalanx, a formation armed with enormous pikes called sarissas, longer than traditional spears, capable of presenting a deadly wall of points to any opponent approaching from the front. Supporting this infantry were cavalry forces trained to strike decisively at critical moments, a commander willing to lead charges personally, and a strategist whose battlefield instincts bordered on genius. In 334 BCE, he crossed into Asia, beginning one of history's most famous campaigns. The Persian Empire possessed vastly greater resources, far larger populations, far more territory. Yet military history repeatedly demonstrates that numbers alone do not determine outcomes. Leadership matters. Organization matters. Morale matters. And Alexander possessed all three in abundance. The first major clash came at the Granicus River. The Persians attempted to stop him. They failed. The defeat did not destroy the empire, but it sent a warning. This was not an ordinary invader. As Alexander advanced through Anatolia, city after city fell into his hands. Some resisted, others surrendered. The momentum continued growing, and eventually King Darius III realized he could no longer rely on provincial commanders to solve the problem. The empire itself would have to respond. A great army was assembled. Troops arrived from across Persian territories. Cavalry, infantry, mercenaries, and among them stood the Immortals, still 10,000 strong in tradition, still carrying the prestige of centuries, still serving as the elite core of Persian power. The armies met near Issus in 333 BC. The battlefield was narrow, a detail that would prove critical. Darius possessed superior numbers, but the terrain limited his ability to use them effectively. Alexander recognized the opportunity immediately. The battle began. Lines advanced. Missiles flew. The noise of thousands of men echoed across the landscape. The Immortals occupied their customary place near the center, facing some of the best infantry in the Macedonian army. The fighting was intense, and for a time, the Persians held. The Immortals did exactly what elite troops are expected to do. They maintained formation, absorbed pressure, and fought with determination. Yet elsewhere on the battlefield, Alexander moved decisively, leading cavalry assaults, exploiting weaknesses, creating chaos. Then came the moment that changed everything. Alexander drove directly toward Darius himself. The Persian king saw danger approaching and made a decision that would haunt his reputation forever. He fled. Perhaps he hoped to survive and continue the war. Perhaps he believed preserving the monarchy mattered more than remaining on the field. Whatever his reasoning, the effect was devastating. Ancient armies often depended heavily upon visible leadership. When the king fled, confidence collapsed. The Persian line began to unravel, and the battle was lost. The Immortals continued fighting even as the situation deteriorated around them. But discipline cannot compensate indefinitely for strategic disaster. Many died, many were scattered, others escaped alongside the remnants of the army. Issus ended in defeat, yet the empire still survived. Darius escaped. New forces could be raised. New armies assembled. The war continued. Alexander spent the following years consolidating his gains. He captured coastal cities, conducted one of the most famous sieges in ancient history at Tyre, entered Egypt as a liberator rather than a conqueror, and strengthened his position before advancing deeper into Persian territory. Meanwhile, Darius prepared for one final effort, one final battle, one final chance to save the empire. The meeting place would be Gaugamela, a vast plain carefully selected by the Persians. This time Darius intended to avoid the mistakes of Issus. The terrain favored large armies. Room existed for cavalry maneuver. The battlefield had even been prepared in advance. Obstacles removed, ground leveled, everything arranged to maximize Persian advantages. The army assembled, there was enormous. Exact numbers remain debated. Ancient writers exaggerated frequently, but there is no doubt it vastly outnumbered Alexander's force. The Immortals stood among the elite formations at the center, their ranks replenished after previous losses, their reputation intact, their duty unchanged. For the soldiers assembled that day, the stakes could not have been higher. Victory might save the empire. Defeat might destroy it. The battle began with every advantage seemingly favoring Persia. But once again, Alexander proved why history remembers him. He identified weaknesses, created opportunities, and struck with extraordinary precision. Persian cavalry attacked. Macedonian formations bent, but did not break. Chariots charged. The Macedonians adapted. The battle spread across the plain. Confusion mounted. Dust filled the air. Thousands fought. Thousands died. And once again, Alexander drove toward the center, toward Darius, toward the heart of Persian resistance. The king saw the danger approaching, and once again, he fled. At that moment, the fate of the empire was effectively sealed. The Immortals fought on. Many remained in position longer than surrounding units. Many resisted desperately, but the battle had already been decided. Without confidence in victory, without coordinated command, without the king, the army collapsed. What followed was catastrophe. The Persian retreat became a rout. Thousands were killed, thousands more scattered, and the military power that had sustained the empire for generations was shattered. As an organized force, the Immortals effectively ceased to exist after Gaugamela. Some survivors accompanied Darius eastward. Others disappeared into provinces. Some may have entered service under new masters. Others likely returned to their families. Their futures vanished into history. The records grow silent. The institution that had stood beside Persian kings for more than 2 centuries had reached its end. Darius fled, trying desperately to rebuild resistance. But the empire was unraveling. Satraps abandoned him. Allies lost faith. And eventually he was murdered by his own followers. The King of Kings died not at the hands of Alexander, but at the hands of men who no longer believed victory was possible. When Alexander found Darius dead, ancient sources tell us he was angered. The conqueror had wanted to defeat the Persian king, not inherit his corpse. He reportedly ensured Darius received a royal burial, a final gesture of respect toward a fallen enemy. With Darius gone, the Achaemenid Empire ended, and with it ended the world that had created the Immortals. The palaces remained. The roads remained, the cities remained, but the empire itself was finished. Alexander became master of Persian lands. Yet even he could not erase everything that came before. Because institutions can die, Empires can collapse, but ideas often survive, and the idea of the immortals proved remarkably resilient. In the centuries that followed, Persian memory preserved them. Later dynasties looked back toward the Achaemenid age with admiration. The Parthians inherited parts of the Persian legacy. The Sasanians consciously revived much of it, including an elite force whose very name echoed the ancient immortals. The concept endured. Elite warriors, royal guardians, symbols of imperial authority. Even beyond Persia, their influence remained visible. Across history, rulers repeatedly created special military units to protect themselves. Elite guards, chosen warriors, professional soldiers standing closest to power. The Roman Praetorian Guard, the Byzantine Varangian Guard, the Ottoman Janissaries, Napoleon's Imperial Guard. Each emerged from different cultures, different eras, different circumstances, yet all reflected principles the Persians had recognized centuries earlier. That rulers need trusted protectors, that elite units can symbolize state power, that discipline and identity can transform ordinary soldiers into extraordinary institutions. The immortals also survived in art. On the stone walls of Persepolis, their carved figures still march in silent formation. Thousands of years after the empire vanished, the faces remain, the spears remain, the memory remains. Visitors standing before those reliefs today see more than ancient artwork. They see a message sent across millennia, a message from a civilization that once stood at the center of the known world. Modern historians continue studying them. Archaeologists continue uncovering clues. Writers continue telling their story. And in this way, the immortals achieved something their creators could never have predicted. Not immortality in life, but immortality in memory. The individual soldiers died. The empire fell. The institution disappeared. Yet the name survived, generation after generation, century after century. The immortals endured. And perhaps that is the most remarkable part of their story. Not that they fought in famous battles. Not that they guarded powerful kings. Not that they helped build one of history's greatest empires. But that after all this time, we still remember them. We still speak their name. We still imagine their ranks standing beneath Persian banners, watching over palaces, marching along royal roads, holding formation in the dust of ancient battlefields. The empire is gone. The kings are gone. The soldiers are gone. Yet their story remains. And as long as people continue telling it, the immortals are not truly lost to history. They endure.